coming?
I have not. But it looks like we have everyone except Mr. Wrench.
Yes. He was querying you about the technology, I gather, was he?
See? Search my email. Yes, and I sent him the link.
We'll give him a minute or two.
Okay. Yeah. Well, how is everyone sheltering in place?
Working away.
Today.
Actually, makes no difference to me. Just business as usual.
Yeah. Actually, we're kind of enjoying it with all the projects around the house and property and stuff. So not bad.
Yeah, good time of year for that.
Yeah.
I think Louise wins the prize for best background.
I think so.
It looks beautiful through your window. Wow.
It is nice, but it's pretty much bowing all around, isn't it?
I guess so.
That's true.
Scenery in the background.
Yeah, I've actually come to like these Zoom meetings. There's a couple of organizations I belong to that I ordinarily would have to travel to Vancouver or even Burnaby. And I don't have to do that anymore, and I love it.
Yeah, this really works pretty well.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I was in one meeting that had 56 participants, but a very aggressive muter in the organizer.
Uh-huh.
So he kept things under control very well, I thought. We need more light on you, Steph.
Yeah, you're in the dark, as usual.
No, never.
She's never in the dark.
Did we lose Kirsty? We lost her. She fell off.
What happened?
Send her an email as well. I wonder, is anybody else getting a bit of feedback?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit.
No, not here.
I'm all clear.
It's a kind of a faint hum.
Oh, I'm hearing a high pitch sound.
Yeah, I just heard that too.
Maybe we should just try to.
It's not bad.
No.
Well, I think if you mute yourself when you're not talking, that'll go away.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
It's still there for me when I mute it. Sounds like someone doing Morse code in the background.
Yeah.
I think it's me, because when I mute, it's not there.
It's you, Steph.
Screaming.
Well, we have a quorum. I'm impressed we should get rolling, and hopefully others will join us. So let's call a meeting to order. Has everyone had a chance to download the agenda and look at items and so on?
Yeah.
Okay. So can I get a motion to approve today's agenda?
So moved.
All right, Dan, a second. Louise, all in favor?
Aye.
The agenda is approved. Can I get a second motion to adopt the minutes from February 19th? Okay, Martin, second. Anyone? Dennis, all in favor? And that's also approved. We don't seem to have any of the public here. So I don't think, unless they drop in suddenly with some kind of Zoom bomb. Moving on to the action items, starting with 4.1. This is about short-term rental amendments to the bylaws, and in particular to the land use bylaw. Emma, I'm going to give it over to you. Maybe you could give us a little background, talk a little bit about this. Does everyone realize that there's a policy that is being that policy components of it are being taken into taken up by sorry, I'm not saying this very well. Within the policy statement, there are 3 bylaws that are affected, and so those are being amended to reflect the intentions of the policy. Everyone's aware of that and they've seen the policy? Okay, great. So go ahead then, Emma.
Okay, thanks, Drew. I actually have a quick presentation if I could share my screen. Is that okay? Okay. Oh, it's been disabled. I could just speak to it if it's causing problems.
Can't hear you, Steph, you're muted.
Can you try again, Emma? Because I've enabled it.
Ah, perfect.
There's Kirsty.
There she
And there's
is.
Kirsty. Hello, Kirsty.
Hey, there we go.
Good timing. Is this working for everyone?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So thank you for the little introduction there, Drew. I'm going to give a quick background on this. Short-term rentals, which we use here to mean a dwelling or portion of a dwelling that is rented for a period of less than 30 days. And they have been increasing on Bowen Island. And while there are some benefits, there are also some potential negative impacts for the community. So Council had directed staff to develop a regulatory approach for short-term rentals over last year, 2019. And at the end of the year, they adopted the short-term rental policy that Drew had mentioned, policy 1905. And its purpose is to establish a regulatory approach for short-term rentals to help facilitate fair short-term rental use and mitigate negative impacts for the community. Following the policy adoption, Council directed staff to prepare bylaw amendments for the land use bylaw, business license bylaw, and the bylaw notice enforcement bylaw to implement the short-term rental policy. So that is what staff is bringing to the Commission today. And just to summarize the key objectives of the short-term rental policy, it is to permit short-term rental use of a dwelling as an accessory use, meaning the principal use of the dwelling is still to be a residence for a member of the community. And regulations will be put in place to minimize the impacts of this short-term rental use on the neighborhood and long-term housing, as well as to help ensure accountability of the operators. And very importantly, these regulations need to be enforceable. So keeping these objectives in mind, I'm going to go over the proposed bylaw amendments and show you how they link to these objectives. Firstly, to permit the use, the land use bylaw will be amended to include a use called residential guest accommodation. This is an accessory use of a dwelling unit that is ordinarily occupied as a residence for temporary accommodations of a period less than 30 days. This is separate from the bed and breakfast use, as well as commercial accommodations that are currently allowed in the land use bylaw. The amendment will also allow bed and breakfasts to have limited kitchen facilities. Currently, they are not allowed any kitchen facilities, and limited kitchen facilities will allow them to have a mini fridge and countertop plug-in appliances. This change was to help bed and breakfast maintain competitiveness as we permit residential guest accommodations with full kitchens. Both residential guest accommodations and bed and breakfasts will be permitted on properties with secondary suites and detached secondary suites. So this is currently not allowed, and this is a direct result of feedback we got from the community, homeowners wanting more flexibility in the use of their property and helping to supplement their income and cover housing costs, but also to help preserve long-term rental housing stock so that owners do not have to decommission their suites in order to short-term rental them. So they don't have to take out the kitchens where the suite will no longer be viable for long-term rental use. There will also be use-specific regulations for residential guest accommodations. Chiefly, this is limiting the use up to 120 days a year, a maximum of 2 guests per bedroom, and a minimum of 1 parking space per bedroom. These types of regulations are to help ensure that the use be accessory and also to minimize the neighborhood impacts. Further regulations are set out in the business licensing bylaw amendment, where residential guest accommodations will require a business license to operate, and the license will need to be displayed in all advertising. Adequate insurance will need to be shown, as well as disclosure of number of bedrooms, guests, and parking used for the residential guest accommodation. The business license fee will be $300, and this was based on research of 11 communities, as well as estimated costs for administration and enforcement. The license also requires that a designated individual be specified as the primary contact for residential guest accommodation. This was one of the top suggestions that we received during the community engagement as a way to ensure operator accountability. This designated individual needs to be available 24/7 during operation and respond to any nuisance complaints within 2 hours. And lastly, the bylaw notice enforcement bylaw will be amended to include penalties for operating a residential guest accommodation without a license. The first contravention will be more of a warning, whereas any further contraventions will impose the maximum penalty of $500 per day. The bylaw already has existing penalties for advertising without displaying a license, as well as contravention of terms of operation, such as the regulations we had just gone over. Aside from the amendments, just to wrap this up, the short-term rental policy does set out an approach for enforcement where a residential guest accommodation that receives 3 confirmed contraventions will have its business license revoked, and they will not be issued a new license for at least 2 years. So that is essentially, out of the whole policy, the strongest reason for compliance. And that pretty much sums up the amendments and the project progress to date. And now I'm going to turn it over to the Commission for comments, specifically how you feel these amendments meet the objectives of the short-term rental policy, and also how well do you find them addressing that balance between economic development interests and mitigating community impacts.
Can you, oops.
We
want me to
unshare the
stop?
screen?
Yeah, can you turn off your, yeah, there we go.
And I did send a link in the chat to the short-term rental policy. If you wanted to keep your eye on that.
So that's 1905?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I can comment if anybody else doesn't want to. I understand the need for a license, and I sort of support that and the rules and the zoning and everything. But I think that the 120-day limit is sort of ridiculous because it just puts the operators under hardship of not making more, they're going to have to pay for the business license. They're going to have to put the parking in, whatever the heck else they're going to do. But it's not going to help with the rental. It's got nothing to do with rental. All that'll happen is that the bed and breakfast or the whatever will be used all summer, and then there will be lots of accommodation in the winter, which isn't when it's needed, because that's not the tourist season, and we have really cyclical work opportunities on the island. So I don't get that at all. It's just adding a restriction when we should be encouraging tourists as much as we can, because who knows what's going to happen with this COVID stuff. The only tourists we're likely to get are locals, and we should welcome them, because they will help our restaurants to keep going. They will help our stores to keep going. And I don't understand the 120 days at all. I think it's ridiculous.
Maybe Emma, you could respond to that.
Sure, really quickly. The 120 days is a total out of a year, so it's not consecutive. They can choose to have that in the summer or the winter or throughout the entire year. It does work out to every single weekend in the year if they choose so. And as mentioned in the presentation, this limit is really intended to keep the use as an accessory use to residential. And what we heard very loudly from the community during the engagement process is that short-term rental use was not so much a concern when it was accessory to the use of a residence for someone in the community. Where the concerns came were when the residences were being used as commercial short-term rental operations, meaning more than 120 days a year, and no one actually lived in the residence. So this is a limit that has been used in other jurisdictions in BC as well as around the world, and for specifically addressing this concern. If an operator felt that they needed more than 120 days in order to be a viable business, they would fall into the category of a commercial accommodation, which we have a number of permitted uses on the island. And that has been made very clear to operators. If they would like to operate more than 120 days a year, they are welcome to pursue a rezoning of their property.
Yeah, which means they're not going to get there. No rezonings are, it's very difficult. Anyway, I think
the rezoning is a public process, and it is a decision for council, and it is based on what the community wants for that property. So if that is something that the community feels like is a suitable use for the property, then they will obtain the rezoning. And same for a temporary use permit. They can also apply for one of those. Other than that, a bed and breakfast is an allowed use on all residential properties as an accessory use as a home occupation, and they can run a bed and breakfast 365 days a year if they wish so. They just need to be a resident that is in the home where the bed and breakfast is being run.
Well, very nice answers, but it makes no sense to me.
I had a couple of questions. Because you've alluded several times, Emma, to the accessory use component.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding of the definition, I'm not quite sure that the definition of accessory use, I'm not sure that I see that this is in fact an accessory use, when in fact, because it means ancillary to a primary use, accessory use, and yet I understand that you would be able to, an owner of a home could rent out their whole home without anyone being resident. So it is the whole home, it's not a portion of it. So I'm not sure how that becomes ancillary to the main use.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. The principal permitted use is dwelling. And if the accessory use of short-term rental is limited to 120 days, that is less than half of the year, clearly less than half of the year. If a homeowner wishes not to occupy their residence for the balance of the year, that is not something that we can regulate in the zoning bylaw.
So the time then, 30% of the year makes it an accessory use. Mm-hmm. I see.
I'm muted. Sorry, I forgot that. Can I just ask the question?
Yeah.
So this bylaw, as I understand it, is intended to protect long-term rentals. Is that correct? Is there any actual language to that effect, if it is true?
There is language in the policy.
Okay. So it's
Yeah,
tied
so
into
in
the
bylaw,
policy.
the language for bylaws in regulations, they don't go into like the whereas statements.
So that's 1905.
Yes.
Where is that in 1905?
I believe it's mentioned several times throughout the policy, but let me pull it up. So in the second paragraph under reason for policy, the last sentence there is to ensure minimal impact on neighborhoods and long-term housing.
All right, and then at the bottom of the page, the second paragraph about in the synopsis.
On the first page, the second paragraph, reason for policy.
Yeah,
The last line talks about the regulation is needed to ensure minimal impact on neighborhoods and long-term housing. And it's repeated again at the bottom of that page, last paragraph on that page. That short-term rentals are a source of community concern, potential to negatively impact long-term housing.
so I mean, it's kind of, it's interesting that the language is there. There's a heavy reliance on the time, like the 30 days consecutive or 120 days total. That's the thing that is intended to mitigate any negative impact on the neighborhood.
In part, along with the other regulations, but the 120 days was chosen to help with the preserving the long-term rental stock.
Is the policy primarily related to Airbnb short-term type rental, or ensuring that residences on the island that don't have full-time use are or property owners that aren't using their property full-time have the ability to rent out their houses in their absence? Is it one or the other? Is it both?
I don't think there's any distinction there, and a seasonal property owner that wants to rent out their house part-time when they're not on the island can do so through Airbnb, so they're not mutually exclusive. If you're asking, does the proposed use, the residential guest accommodation in the amendment, does that allow for Airbnb or for a part-time homeowner? If they meet the regulations, both could fall under that use.
It seems to read in a lot of ways that the primary purpose is for owners who aren't using their residence on a full-time basis. So I'm just wondering, with regard to language, because it almost excludes the concept of short-term Airbnb type rentals in the language.
I guess to answer your question, I would need to establish what is meant by short-term rental and what is meant by B&B. Bed and breakfast is a type of short-term rental. So it would be considered a short-term rental in that it's rented for a period less than 30 days inside a residence. It is already permitted. Bed and breakfasts are already allowed in the land use bylaw on all residential lots for 365 days a year, as long as they comply with the home occupation regulations. And one of those is that they cannot rent out the entire dwelling when they are not home. So bed and breakfast needs to be run by an operator that is a resident of the home where it is being operated. The The reason for undertaking this entire project and developing these regulations is to address the short-term rental of entire dwellings and suites that is found across Bowen Island. And those do not meet the regulations for a bed and breakfast. They are renting out the entire home. They are not residents of the home. And many of them run the operation 365 days a year, and they never live on Bowen Island, and they are not considered a member of the community. When we did the community engagement on how Bowen Island would like to see short-term rentals regulated, we heard very clearly that they are very important to the island economy, that we have very few accommodations on the island, and they fill that need very well. But we also heard a lot from the community that the short-term rentals that were being run year-round that did not have an owner that lived on the island were the main sources of nuisance and safety concerns, and concerns around impacts on servicing infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, garbage, a very long list of concerns. And they were from short-term rentals that were not being used as an accessory use to a residence for a member of the community. So the suite of regulations in the proposed bylaw amendments are to address that very specific list of concerns. It is to allow short-term rental use that is done responsibly, where the operator is accountable, and it can be in your entire home, it can be in your secondary suite, but it is not meant to use a home in a neighborhood that should be used for a residence of a member of the community, to be used commercially year-round and bring in transient guests year-round into a neighborhood with various potential impacts. So that is the intent of the policy and these amendments. I don't know if that addresses your question or if I missed anything.
That background is very helpful. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, although I thought I understood it before that discussion, and so I'm a little lost. As far as I can tell, Emma, there's no distinction in the bylaw between somebody who has rents out on an Airbnb basis their entire house, which is, people do that. They find somebody to rent their place, and then they go stay with friends or something like that. And then the other model is that you have a suite with a separate entrance even in your house, so you stay there and then rent out. And is that a distinction that matters at all, or are both situations covered by the bylaw to begin with?
The situations are covered, but they do limit what is allowed. So in the situations you just described, if I'm understanding them correctly, the first one is a homeowner that lives in their house, but they then vacate their house when they are able to rent it out for a short-term rental.
Right.
So the entire house, that is.
Yes.
So under the proposed amendments, that use would fall under the residential guest accommodation use. They will need to obtain a business license and follow all the regulations for the residential guest accommodation use. And they can do that up to 120 days out of a year.
Okay, yeah. And I, just to make Kirsty feel happy, I agree with Kirsty, but I just assumed that the 120 days was a policy decision by council in response to community feedback, and that we didn't have authority or jurisdiction to comment on it or try to alter it.
That's exactly why it's being brought to the committees and to the APC for comment, specifically on these types of points. And to address your second scenario, where people have secondary suites with separate entrances. So they are living in the main house and their suite is empty and they want to rent it out. That would be considered a residential guest accommodation.
Okay.
If the suite were an accessory building, so it's no longer considered a suite, meaning it does not have a kitchen, it's not a self-contained dwelling unit, If that is the case where it's not a self-contained dwelling unit, it is just an accessory building, then renting that out as a short-term rental would be considered a bed and breakfast.
Okay, so
They
they'd
could
need
run
that, they'd need that license. And then I have one very specific question.
Oh, but sorry, just to wrap that up, if it did have a kitchen and it was considered a secondary suite, it would fall under the residential guest accommodation use. So they're still allowed to do that if it was a suite, but they could only do it for up to 120 days.
Okay. And
Isn't that gonna- oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm going to change the topic though, Kirsty, if you want to comment on what Emma just said first.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, isn't that just gonna encourage people to take their kitchens out? And then they're gonna be like, I just think that we're putting restrictions in for, like, to cause problems.
Okay. And actually, that was my question. I saw a limited kitchen, but I don't see a definition of limited kitchen. But Emma, you seem to have a pretty clear idea. You mentioned a small fridge, a stovetop.
Yeah, the definition is already existing in the land use bylaw.
It is there already. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
I am just on the use. I had a question about, so because these can occur anywhere, and it could occur on a property where there's a home that has a secondary suite. So conceivably, I could have, I don't know, a 5-bedroom home, and I have a suite that's the maximum, so it's 90 square meters. So it'll have 2 more bedrooms. So I've got 7 bedrooms, I've got potentially 14 guests, and I need 7 parking stalls on my property to accommodate that. Well, I mean, but that is that's the way that it's set up, right? Maybe there aren't that many homes of that size. My question comes a little bit to, is that part of the intention? Because that's getting to be a pretty big operation, but presumably you can do it all as an STR and have 2 suites operating on your property in effect for 120 days a year, and have those full of guests, and there's no intention that the guests have to know each other or anything like that. Not a family operation. And then there's a whole question around who actually monitors all of that, which is outside of our jurisdiction, but I think it becomes, if you can set a bunch of rules in place, but if you don't actually have some kind of methodology for what the oversight is, it becomes a little bit like it's your great policy.
It's going to come down to neighbor complaining, I think.
Well, that seems to be the intention when I read through the
I'm not
documentation.
approving of that, but that's where we're left.
Yeah, I wondered, and this is again is maybe out of our area of jurisdiction, whether there should be at the time of licensing, whether there should be an inspection of the facility that's being licensed to get some sense of compliance, what the municipality is licensing, because giving somebody a license in a way is approving what they're doing. And if you don't really know, could the municipality not be running itself into some kind of legal problems by giving a license to someone to operate in a way that may not actually be compliant with the bylaws?
Okay, so there's a number of questions and points you'd like me to address there. I'll try and do them all in order. If I miss anything, let me know.
All right.
Is it okay for a large house with a lot of rooms and a secondary suite with additional rooms, with all the required parking on a large lot, to run a short-term rental as the proposed residential guest accommodations? And the answer is yes. So if they comply with all the regulations as set out, each of the dwellings will need a business license and meet all of the regulations. Whether or not a property owner...
Sorry, on that point, does the suite and the house need a separate license, or is one license good for all?
No, each operation is a separate business license.
Oh.
So each dwelling unit. Yeah. And I've forgotten your second point already.
Well, it had to do with regulation more than with how it's set up. a certain number of rules are established in the land use bylaw, ultimately in terms of parking and so on, what the facility is like. But I don't see any mechanism for actually ensuring that there is compliance between the bylaw requirements and the operator.
Okay, yeah, the compliance. And I have to say, enforcement is completely within the jurisdiction of the municipality and completely within the scope of what the APC can or could comment on. So the enforcement approach is set out in the policy. And just to summarize, and this is based on the research of what other communities have done and what is worked, what is effective, what is legally enforceable, that we can actually, take to court and have good chances of winning. And also based on what the municipality has in terms of resources, both for staffing and for equipment and for services. So the approach that has been taken and set out in the policy is to employ online monitoring services, and the business licensing inspector will be performing random checks throughout the year based on the number of short-term rentals that are licensed. And also mentioned, I think Michael mentioned, based on complaints. This is actually not a choice of staff. Enforcement on a complaint basis is the position that the municipality has taken since it was incorporated. So that is something that we also had to work into this policy to be consistent with the municipal position on enforcement. So it will be complaint basis as far as anything beyond the random checks and what is flagged in the online monitoring service. At time of licensing, we did consider requiring in-person inspections of the premises, but we do not have enough staffing to do that. And the fire chief has already said that they will not be doing fire safety inspections for certain. So it is not, it's not feasible given the amount of resources the municipality has. But at the same time, your concerns around legal liabilities for licensing a premise without inspection, we do have legal opinion on that, and it is not a concern. The way that we have written the business license, the owner acknowledges that there are these codes and other regulations that they must follow, and they are completely liable for compliance with those codes and regulations.
Yeah.
Did I address all of your questions?
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, not to keep hammering away at it, but it's going to be tough to enforce the 120 days. I mean, who's going to count them?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, unless somebody's renting it out full time, 365 days a year, I don't think anybody's going to notice.
Yeah, and well, to be fair, the short-term rental operations that have received a lot of complaints are running more than 120 days, closer to 365 days, and there are legal cases where, based on the online monitoring data, it can hold up in court. That being said, I'm not sure if we'll go down that road, being a complaint-driven enforcement. It would need to be a property that was causing a lot of issues, and then we will document and gather all the data needed and bring them to court.
Okay.
But it can be done, and we have the tools to do it.
All right. Are there comments or questions? David?
I wanted to just mention the 120 days. The 120 days, that was quite an issue at council because, I mean, go back to the beginning, there are the two concerns that we're trying to address. One, so you're not causing a fuss in the neighborhood, and making sure you have a person who's on site or can deal with any issues within 2 hours was an important part of that. The other part is that you're not causing a problem, not cutting into long-term rentals. And so if you look in the policy on page 3, there's a little paragraph halfway down, and I'll just read it to you. The 120-day limit would also help minimize impacts on long-term housing. 120 days of STR operation would yield similar income to a full year of long-term rental, allowing the option of long-term rental to remain competitive with STR. So that was an important part of that discussion. We don't want to make it so that, wow, you can make so much money doing Airbnb instead of renting your place out for the year that you're just going to do that. So limiting it to so that you actually can't make more money than if you rented the place out for the year, then it helps deal with that long-term rental issue. So that's where that 120 days came from, and that's why it was a point of discussion.
Yeah, that was an issue I had, was wondering about the 120 days, and that explains a lot. So yeah, that makes sense to me.
And there are precedents in other municipalities for that time frame.
Nelson and Revelstoke in BC, but also in LA and Paris, just off the top of my head. Useful background information, our preliminary data, which has shown 123 short-term rental online listings for Bowen as of last year, averaged less, each listing averaged less than 60 days of operation a year. So 120 days does seem quite reasonable for the Bowen community, given the numbers that we're seeing.
All right. What do you need from us, Emma? Do you need a summary? Do you need a?
A motion I would like. Emma, you would like?
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys agree to support the 120 days? Do you agree to support the enforcement, the business license process of inspection?
Or if there are any changes you feel strongly about for the proposed amendments?
Any suggestions?
Well, I'm happy to support the licensing, but I'm not happy to support the 120 days. So if they're together, then I will be opposed. If they're separate issues, then I will support one and not the other.
Okay, well, I'll move the recommending the licensing, so we can split them into two motions.
Okay, I'll second that.
Michael,
Which number
thank you.
is licensing, Emma? So 502. So you're going to support bylaw 502?
Yep, bylaw 502 is for business licensing, and the 120-day limit is in the land use bylaw amendment 501. 503 is the bylaw notice enforcement bylaw, and that does not have anything to do with the 120 days either.
Okay, so do you guys want to just generally support the business licensing and the notice enforcement bylaw together? Or do you want to be all separate?
Yes.
Yes.
Together, okay. So,
Yes.
So moved by Dennis. Is that a friendly amendment?
Yes.
Michael, are you willing to second that amendment?
Yes.
Do we have any further discussion? Can you read that to us again, Steph?
that the Advisory Planning Commission support bylaw number 196 and bylaw number 502. Or
All in
we
favor?
have council direct staff to proceed with. I can tweak that later, just simple.
Okay, all right. We seem to be unanimous on that point.
Now
Now the contentious one.
the 120 days, recommending the 120 days.
Do I have a motion to limit the use of STRs to 120 days per annum?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're voting on right now.
Land use bylaw.
Land use bylaw, yeah.
Okay, so just to support it, okay.
So just for clarity, are you not supporting the entire amendment or just the 120-day limit?
It appears that the 120-day limit does not have unanimous support. we can tease that apart if we need to.
Yeah,
I think that was the intention, was to tease it apart.
Right, exactly. So we thought we voted on everything except the 120 days in that last motion.
You
my
voted
mind.
on the business licensing bylaw 465, you supported it, and you voted on the notice bylaw number 196, you supported it. Your new resolution is to vote on bylaw 501, which is the land use amendment. There are different factors included in that, including the 120 days. So,
Okay.
And we tease that apart then? Can we pull the 120-day piece out of that and make that? Because I think the other aspects of the amendment to the land use bylaw are not contentious here.
okay, so you want to support the bylaw with the exclusion of the 120-day limit?
That's
Yes.
correct.
The exclusion of the 120
But
days.
should we not, is that not something we should be voting on?
I think we need to vote on
Yeah,
it, yes.
we're wording what we're voting on.
But if we're voting on leaving it as it is, and there's objection to the 120 days, then that would be the dissenting vote, would it not?
We could do it that way. But I think there would still be, like,
I think what Emma's saying, Louise, is that the dissenting vote, it's not clear what they're objecting to.
I've only heard two in the discussion. I've only heard two dissenting voices on the issue of 120 days. I'm not sure how
Okay.
contentious it really is. Maybe we can just get a sense of the flavor of that, whether we need to take it apart.
Okay, I don't know if you saw me as one of the dissenting people. I don't dissent so much as I would abstain if it came to a motion on that specific point, because as I say, it's a policy decision that council has made, and I don't think we have the authority to overrule it. So.
You're being asked to comment on that.
Okay, well, my comment is that they probably haven't made the right decision.
My sense is it will be too challenging to enforce for it to be a real issue, except in the cases where it is an issue and it should be enforced.
Yeah, but you know, this is problematic when you make a bylaw provision that you know you can't enforce.
Right.
Although David's argument is pretty persuasive.
Yeah.
I understood the motion that I seconded was to approve everything except the 180-day provision, on the understanding that the 120-day provision would be the subject of a subsequent motion.
I'm sorry.
Does that make sense, Steph?
Go ahead, Zaid. Yeah.
No, so there are 3 bylaws.
Yes.
One bylaw is about business licensing, and the second one is about notice enforcement. You voted on supporting those 2 bylaws,
Right.
and that's over. The discussion is now about the 3rd bylaw, which is about the land use. And
Yes.
things in it. One of the things in that is the 120 days.
Right. 3.56 sub 1.
And I feel like there has to be some kind of time frame in that bylaw. And I mean, 120 days seems reasonable, but I think it helps to hold people to account, whether or not it's 100% enforceable. Because it still could be enforceable. It does provide for the ability to be enforced.
Okay. Well, as a practical matter, if the majority are in favor of the 120 days, we can just approve all the amendments.
How I can word it is I can say support the bylaw, including the 120-day limit, and that way the dissenting vote, you know what they're dissenting about.
Yeah.
Is that okay, Kirsty?
Yeah, sure. Well, because I'm going to dissent. Because I think we do have a real issue on the island about the places being bad neighbors. Of course, rental houses are bad neighbors often as well. So it's just one of the many ways, and ownered houses can be bad neighbors. But I don't think the 120 days has anything to do with that. You know, I don't believe it's going to help with long-term rentals, but that's my opinion. So anyway, that's why I'm dissenting. I think it's unenforceable, and you should be enforcing things based on being nuisance guests as opposed to on being over 120 days. I think that's just sort of anyway, not a useless thing. And the good guys will follow that and the bad ones won't.
I guess really bylaw enforcement is not our end of the store either.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we modify the motion?
So, yeah, so I've got the Advisory Planning Commission support bylaw number 57, amendment bylaw 501, including the 120-day limit.
Okay.
Do I have a motion?
That's the motion.
And do I have a mover of that motion?
I thought, oh, okay.
We haven't we voted on the other one. I don't think we have a mover and seconder on this motion.
Michael?
Yeah, Louise put her hand up.
Louise is moving. Do I have a seconder?
Oh, okay.
Martin, all in favor? And opposed? We have Kirsty is opposed.
Wait, what do I have for Michael?
Mike,
I'm just not going to vote on it.
So that counts as a vote in the affirmative.
Oh, does it? Okay, then I'm
Yeah.
opposed.
Okay, 2 opposed. Great, thank you. We have a second agenda item on the agenda.
temporary use.
Temporary, yeah, that's right. 5.1 is new business, temporary use permits. I believe this has to do with the wording of the OCP. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks. So this is actually Daniel's file, so I'm just helping him present while he's away. It's a pretty straightforward matter. The provincial legislation requires that our official community plan designate the physical area where council can consider issuing temporary use permits. So while we do have provisions and conditions set out in our official community plan for temporary use permits to help guide council decisions in reviewing those applications, there is not an area actually designated. So we are addressing that with this official community plan amendment. And based on a review of about a dozen comparable communities, how it's being done in most places that would be suitable for Bowen Island is to designate the whole of the island as the area for council to consider issuing temporary use permits. So that is the proposal that's being brought to the Advisory Planning Commission for comment. We are seeking comment before we draft the OCP amendment because the legislation also requires early and ongoing consultation. So we will be taking this to the Islands Trust as well to get comment on this proposal before we draft the amendment. Once the amendment is drafted, it will still go through the OCP amendment process and will probably come back to the commission for another round of referral.
Help me understand why this is complicated.
It has arisen. It has arisen as a function of the IDLC application for a school in Deep Bay, and that in part failed because they were trying to bring that forward using a temporary use permit, and the opponents to that idea used the notion that a temporary use permit was not specifically allowed to be allocated within Deep Bay to defeat it.
Yeah.
Because so in other words, by not specifying that you could use a temporary use permit anywhere on Bowen, it means you cannot use it you cannot use it anywhere on Bowen.
Yeah. I could say my own reaction to this material is that we're plugging a hole. We're
Right.
plugging a loophole, if I could put it even that way. And something for a clever lawyer to, well, something a clever lawyer did grab a hold of to further his client's interests or her client's interests.
Right.
Yep, so until we pass some sort of amendment designating an area, Bowen Island cannot consider any temporary use permits. So that's why.
Let's roll on and get it done.
Just I have a couple of questions. The
Yes,
temporary
Louise.
permits, do they apply only to private land, or is public land also included in temporary use permits? And is there a separate event use permit for public land? A public land.
Community-owned land?
I mean,
Community-owned land?
like public land or park or crown land or conservation land. And I'm thinking of this in part with our conservation development policy. How are those things governed with regard to temporary use permits?
My recollection going back a number of years, we were looking at applications for vending carts, which would be on the side of the road. So in the public domain, not on private property, food carts. And those would have been covered under temporary use permits. So the temporary use permits extend beyond private property. Could.
Yeah, the use of land covers all land on Bowen Island, including municipal land.
But it doesn't include the crown land. That's not your land to do anything about.
Our land use bylaw also covers uses on crown land, but we are very limited in what we can impose on crown land.
You can have a temporary grow up.
Yeah. I think that the recommendation that it applies to the whole island makes all the sense in the world, because it's going to be hard to define just where, and there's possibilities for temporary use almost everywhere. Yeah. That may be appropriate for a period of time. So
right.
I recommend that we support staff recommendation.
Yeah, I agree with Dennis. I was initially attracted to the idea of accepting park and conservation areas, but I think what we need to do is make it very clear that it does apply to the whole island, and then trust the staff. If somebody brings forward an application for a temporary use permit in a park area or a marine protection area or something like that that's inappropriate, it will not be issued.
Yeah.
So
I think that's the best approach.
I was also thinking of including the parks and conservation areas. So I'm just wondering why we wouldn't do that.
Oh, because there may be a legitimate use for a park area. For example, the Loggers Show is in a municipal park.
And that was part of my other question about event use, like event permits, as opposed to temporary use permits. Is there a distinction on Bowen Island between those two things?
Good question.
I'm not aware of an event permit other than for within road allowance. But on municipal land, if you are looking to have a use that for your event that isn't permitted, it will require a temporary use permit. So like the Veterans Park for the Logger Show, they needed a temporary use permit for the use of assembly, which is not permitted in the park.
And does BowFest require that too?
BowFest does not have a temporary use permit that I'm aware of.
So I would be more in favor of having an event permit process as opposed to having public, crown, and conservation land included in a temporary use permit.
Yeah, BowFest, we have different classifications of parks, and the BowFest park does allow for assembly. So the temporary use permit was, the zoning in the Veterans Park was actually residential. So it definitely needed. Yeah, it wasn't rezoned at the time of subdivision for some reason, even though it's dedicated as park. Yeah, so it was a bit of housekeeping there as well. So temporary use permits on public land is not common, but it does go through the public process and it is at the discretion of council.
Is there a minimum length of time that a temporary use permit can be issued for?
Yeah, it can be up to 3 years with one renewal allowed, but the term is set by council.
That would be a maximum. Is there a minimum? Like, can you get a temporary use permit for a day?
I would have to revisit the legislation, but I'm not aware of a minimum.
But I'm
It's-
just
it's a-
thinking that,
It's a costly process and it's quite long. So I don't know if someone wants to go through like a 4 or 5 month process for a
right,
day.
I understand temporary use permits are useful where you want to do a test run of a use in an area before you rezone it.
Exactly.
It's quite, so it's a little bit different from an event permit, Louise. And I guess
Mhm.
I understand what you're saying. And I think there's a place for what you're talking about. And perhaps that has not yet been addressed.
That's what I was thinking, is that maybe we could provide a comment that assuming the motion passes, but that the use of temporary use permits has to somehow be integrated with event permits or the other permission processes, events, assembly, et cetera,
Right. To eliminate redundancy, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
We
For
don't
clarity.
have an event permit.
Right.
Okay. Well, that brings me back to the logger show. So how did they just had a permit to assemble? Is that it?
It was a temporary use permit.
It was a TUP. Oh,
Yes.
They went through, yeah, it took them a long time to get it.
okay. Well, maybe
Which-
that's okay. I don't know. I mean, I don't think any of that derogates from the notion that the TUP should apply to the entire island.
Right.
No,
But
that's good.
that's where I come back to concern about how conservation land or crown land or public land would be used if it's all open to a temporary use permit.
The temporary use permits have to go through a huge fuss to get there. So I think that if there's a problem with using a piece of land, that there will be oodles of opportunity for people to comment and the community to be against it. I think that if you start segmenting the land on the temporary use, it just becomes more complex. And the temporary use process is complex enough to stop terrible things happening.
Can you be, Louise, can you be a little more specific about what your concern might be? So just to get a bit of the flavor of it.
Well, I guess it's when I started to think about how the conservation development was going to be integrated and ownership of that land, if it transfers, like essentially that land, if it transfers into a public domain, would be available or open for use. And how does that affect the sort of the general concept of what we put forward with regard to conservation development and increasing property values because we have more nature. I guess that's where it's coming from, is that how is sort of control of conservation land or crown land monitored or considered? With regard to impact on islanders or islanders' enjoyment of a particular part of land.
So to Kirsty's point, it's a little bit, the question is whether there should be a blanket allowance for the temporary use permits. Your concern is specific to a particular area or particular areas on the island. It is a process, even if a temporary use permit is allowed, it doesn't mean that it will automatically be granted. that there is a process that needs to be followed in order to, in which there will be public input into that process before a temporary use will actually be allowed to occur.
And I guess I'm not familiar with the process, so my assumption, prior to coming into this conversation was that it was quite simple.
Does Emma want to just run through the process for people? So I can be clear on.
Sure. Temporary use permit application goes to council twice. The first is an introduction, and at that point, council can flat out reject it for any number of reasons they want and not consider it. If they do want to consider it, it has to go through a public notice period. It has to be advertised in the local paper on the municipal website for a certain period to receive comment. And if it's particularly contentious, we usually do an open house as well. Any neighbors to the property will also be notified. Like each property will receive a notice, and there will be a sign posted on the property as well. And then after the notice period, the comments and feedback will go back to council for consideration.
That's a process.
Yeah.
So another question, if I may, on where this leads to long-term. If there's a TUP ongoing on a property, would that, or is there a mechanism built into this bylaw that would force a rezoning ultimately?
6 years.
So
Is
it's
this-
Well, I mean,
two
it wouldn't
consecutive-
force, we can't force any property owner to rezone, but as Drew mentioned, the temporary use permit is only good for the 3-year term and then 1 renewal. So after that, they can't get any more. They can't use it anymore. It's not valid anymore.
Okay.
So if they want to
After
continue,
6
they
years,
would
the
need to
use
rezone.
becomes non-conforming.
Mhm.
And
And that's the maximum term. So council has issued temporary use permits for 1-year terms, just depending on the proposal and the risk involved, what council deems is safe, a suitable term.
Emma, is that the reason why IDLC got booted out of the Cowans Point area? Because they
No.
ran out of PUP?
No,
Because that wasn't zoned to be a school ever.
no. It was considered a home occupation.
I see. With the 15 cars parked there every day.
We have not gotten complaints or
No, it
documented
was,
that many cars.
well, there were. So,
So, do we have a motion to allow TUPs throughout all of Bowen Island?
I'll move.
Okay,
Kirsty, second.
I'll second.
Dennis, second. All in favor? We are unanimous. So you can go ahead with that then, Emma.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right.
All right.
I think we have no other, Emergency Operations Center updates.
That's just an information item.
Okay.
Link to that. I like to do little info items for you guys.
Uh-huh.
Relevant.
No, I read it. It's interesting. It's interesting to know what's going on. We are boldly following the province.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. In which case, I think I could take a motion to adjourn from.
Thank you very much, you guys.
Almost anyone.
Thanks.
Martin.
Sorry, I was late getting in. It wouldn't let me in. Just kept saying thing and didn't want me to join.
You were in and then you left, so I was no
Yeah, I
longer.
just maybe my wireless or my internet is crummy.
Right.
Yeah, we had your iPad for a while, but not you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for doing this today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
You're welcome.
good meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, Greg.
Bye.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.